This morning, Charles' husband will speak about segregation, and I think you have a little bit changed what you are speaking about. I'm not so sure. Let's see. Charles has been helping Sosocom for 25 years, building up our Center for Ethnical Relations and Nationalism, and have been in Sosocom 3 weeks every year, I think, for the last 25 years. So we have a very old relation, and he has done a great job for Sosocom during these years. Please, Charles, tell us about yourself first. Then.
I'm Charlie Husband. I see myself as an interdisciplinary social scientist. I'm a member of the British Psychological Society, of the British Sociological Association. I have no home base, but I do have a pathetic need for my academic work to have policy relevance. So throughout my life, I've worked with journalists, educationists, doctors and nurses, NGOs, trying to apply social science. And I understand that this is the first workshop of what's going to be a rolling programme. And when I saw my title, How to Combat Segregation and Racism, I decided that rather than talk about nuts and bolts of specific programmes, because you already will have expertise in that area, I wanted to go back a bit and talk about the assumptions we bring to this task of how do we combat racism, how do we prevent segregation, and really address the framework of assumptions within which we all work. One of the persistent conclusions I've reached is that given any policy initiative, there's always the scope for deeply held disagreement about how to address it. Secondly, I'm also distressed that good intentions are absolutely no guarantee of appropriate and effective intervention. So for the first half of my 45 minutes, I want to sort of peel back the onion of these layers of assumption we bring to the task of addressing racism, of seeking to develop programs to challenge processes of discrimination and segregation. I want to start with two concrete examples of my attempt to apply my work to tell you why I think it makes sense to pause and say, where are we sitting when we start? What assumptions are we carrying in our backpacks? And what assumptions can we make about who are our natural allies? And how well do we know our natural enemies? So, Government of Western Australia, 2004. If I speak too fast, stop me. And if I don't speak loudly enough, stop me. It's insulting enough that I have to speak in English. But I've prepared a 20-several-page background notes for you to dig into as a resource pack to back up what I'm saying. And Robert will send that out. 2004-05, I was asked to work with the Government of Western Australia to develop across
Charles. Excuse.
Charles, I'm so sorry to interrupt you,
Yes.
but we have slight difficulties hearing. Could you be slightly more near the microphone?
No, I moved the microphone. Now it's nearer.
Can you hear me better now?
Okay.
Yeah, Robert was hanging on to the mic. He was going to censor me.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, it's much better. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
I live in fear of talking for 45 minutes and nobody understanding a word. Okay, Western Australia. The programme was to develop across all the government departments a programme to challenge racism and to promote equality in service delivery. The context when I got there was that I worked in a government agency that it was essentially an office of multicultural affairs. It saw its task as promoting harmonious community relations. Within about first 2 or 3 months of working there, I realised that this organisation was part of the problem, not part of the solution. Why? First of all, as you see the model that I will roll out, there was some tension between my anti-racism and their well-intentioned multiculturalism. there was a gap in politics. More importantly, the agency I was attached to develop this had no power. It was advisory, it was persuasive, it had no muscle. So I went to the Premier and said, I want to move this programme to the Equal Opportunities Commission, because the Commissioner had awesome powers. She was barely answerable to Parliament. Material that came out from the Equal Opportunities Commission had a force. And I had the commitment of the Premier, and he facilitated that switch. In terms of the resistance that I experienced, part of it was that difference of perspective between my, as it were, hard-nosed politics of wanting to push a rights agenda, which I'll come to, and the general consensus within the agency I was working, which was about promoting harmonious community relations. These two are not mutually exclusive, but harmonious community relations doesn't guarantee rights. It can, in fact, be a way of masking the facilitation of ongoing discrimination. I had the commitment of the Premier, and that was absolutely important. The first time this programme went up for being passed at the Cabinet, the Premier was out of the country, and it was turned down immediately. In presenting the material to the Cabinet, I had literally two of the senior members of Cabinet giving me good old American hate stares. May the ground open up and swallow you, husband, you pommy bastard. That sort of sentiment was crackling in the air. When Jeff Gallup came back, I went to see him, and he reinstated the policy. So there was resistance in different forms, and the support was absolutely essential. Nice little end story to this. Last year, a right-wing government closed down the Substantive Equality Unit and halved the budget for the Equal Opportunities Commission. The location where you're based is critical to the success of what you're doing, and understanding where your enemies are coming from is pretty helpful in understanding how to proceed. My second example might be something closer to home. ECHA, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. I think Helsinki is a member. This is a UNESCO initiative with over 100 cities committed to a 10-point plan of action. For over 6 years, I was scientific advisor to this organisation. There's an agreed 10-point plan of action that you sign up to when you join ECHA. There was a massive variation in perspective and commitment. One city we went to was implementing what I regarded as 1960s samosas, steel bands, cultural diversity, absolute non-engagement with rights, with inequality. One of the senior members of a city that saw itself as a vanguard in this area, over a coffee one day, leant to me and said, the Muslims want to build a mosque. How can we let this happen? How would we know what they were doing? So within an organisation with an explicit commitment to your agendas, massive variation in both understanding of what it might mean and indeed level of commitment. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of wanting to address some of the context that we need to reveal about how in Finland you can do what you want to do. I want to start by just basically talking about national self-imagery, modern social imaginaries, and the invention of tradition. All nation states are actively constructing their history in order to make sense of their present. And one of the issues I would like to raise is our sense of self-regard. The British see themselves as desperately nice, the haven of refugees, the mother of parliaments, irrespective of the fact that our unwillingness to accept Jewish refugees in the Second World War was shameful, that our current refusal to make a meaningful response to the asylum seeker situation in Europe. These historical facts have never got in the way of our positive self-image. And I would just like to reflect on what you think is the Finnish positive self-image. In the 80s, when I had a strange relationship with the Norwegian Ministry of Immigration, it was clear then that Sweden saw itself as a progressive and very civil society who had the competence to advise its neighbours about how to proceed in handling immigration. I wonder how Finland sees itself. And with the notion of modern social imaginaries, we're talking about those deep eddies in our culture about how we understand ourselves, the centre of gravity about what we can expect of each other, where we're really coming from. And as an outsider, I'm always fascinated in the invention of history in Finland, the significance of the Winter War and the careful forgetting of the Civil War. So, in a country where you've got members of the true Finns in government, where are we starting from in addressing this issue here in Finland? So for me, these are issues that I want to, as it were, make clear, to reveal before we go too far. I've got a hang-up about tolerance, and I want to share it with you, because I think often in policies to develop social cohesion, a very popular phrase across Europe in the last decade, to promote harmonious community relations, to justify attempts to address equality and discrimination. Tolerance often emerges as the key moral concept. We are a tolerant people. And I want to share with you my anxiety about using that as a backing for any program you may want to develop. This is something I said in 1995, and I've never felt the need to back away from it. For tolerance to be necessary, there must be a prior belief that the person to be tolerated has an intrinsically undesirable characteristic, or that they're not fundamentally entitled to the benefits which are to be allowed them. Those to be tolerated, by definition, possess some such social stigma. Tolerance is the exercise of largesse by the powerful, ultimately on behalf of the powerful. It's the generous extension of forbearance towards someone who is intrinsically objectionable or not deserving of the privilege being allowed. Let me just unpick that for you. My children are all now in their 40s, so now when I'm in restaurants and cafes, I tolerate other people's young children. 30-something years ago, I stopped smoking. I tolerate smokers. Given the opportunity to drink a decent malt whisky, particularly from Islay, I've never been known to tolerate it. I do not tolerate a sunny day walking along the foreshore in Helsinki. Tolerance requires that there's something objectionable that we must put up with. Tolerance is an exercise of power. You've got to have the discretionary capacity to give or to withhold, to be nice or to not be nice. So behind the notion of tolerance, I think, there is the veiled presence of power. Tolerance has a hidden agenda. The people who are tolerated are expected to be grateful because we have tolerated. Bloemet and Verschuren, I've written this into the notes for you, working in Belgium, developed this notion of the limits of tolerance. And their argument is that across Europe, there's a sort of shared consensus that within any nation state, there's a natural limit about how far our well-established tolerance could go. And that one of the functions of the state is to regulate political policy in order that the people can continue to practice their well-rehearsed tolerance. Now, the policies that you might need to develop that would include draconian immigration policies, policies to limit the rights of immigrants, efforts to polish up your own self-esteem. The notion of the limits of tolerance is one I think that you can see across Europe. that societies, in being intolerant, actually rehearse their tolerance. That it's only because of our tolerance we've got to resist immigration. It's only because of our tolerance we've got to be very careful about welfare benefits to asylum seekers. Otherwise, we threaten our national capacity for being nice. You see my reasons for being suspicious about the virtue of tolerance as a package we may unthinkingly, routinely carry with us as part of a national consensus about where we start in developing policies. And it's one of the things that I think feeds into this question of how do you know who your natural allies are and what's the limit of their imagination? And how do you know who your natural enemies are? And what is it that focuses their way of thinking that makes you a natural enemy to them? And I think this shift between tolerance and rights is one breaking point. And my career for 30 years at least has been fixated around the issue of rights as a point of leverage for addressing discrimination and racism. So I am talking to the topic, but not in concrete terms. I think to go to the concrete before you've talked to yourselves about what's the package we are operating in. I mean, I don't want to be rude, but I think Finnish society, like my society, is still significantly patriarchal. So if we think about the topic that we're discussing together today, what do you make of the gender balance in all three rooms? If it's a patriarchal society, why are there so few men? What does it tell you about the significance of this issue in Finland? If this was a high priority area, men would be banging at the door, wouldn't they? I don't want to comment about the ethnic balance because I don't want to read from physiognomy to identity, but I have my suspicions. How many years have Somalis been present in Helsinki? 30? Tolerance, rights. So let me move on to rights. How am I doing for time? Yes. I'm sorry if I'm condensing a lot of stuff, but I have spelled this out in the background notes for you. Why do I like to use rights as a platform for saying, how do we address racism? Partly because when we contest rights and put rights on the table, we address something that is fundamental to presence in a country. Citizenship, legality, the basis of your presence here. And if we talk about rights, we are talking about extending to each other a framework of understandings about our ability to claim the legitimacy of our presence and the legitimacy of our access to the resources of society. That's why I'm interested in rights. So again, to clear the background, I have problems with individual human rights. Feminists have been very good at critiquing universal individual human rights. Iris Marion Young, one of them, has argued persuasively that within a universalist provision of individual rights, it is the interests and priorities of the majority that come to define what are the normative needs and cultural practices that should be addressed through treating people equally. Put bluntly, if we all have access to universal human rights, the post-Second World War basket of common rights, in most countries, men have interpreted what these rights mean. In Western countries, white men have interpreted what these rights mean. In Finland, are the Sami determining what their rights are, or are the non-Sami determining what their rights are? You all have access to the same basket of universal rights, but who interprets what those rights are? So it's again an invitation to say, in the context of Finland, how real are the rights that everybody has access to? We can speak glibly about universal human rights, but their interpretation process is processed through a political context. For at least 20 years, I have been, again, fixated, as I tend to be, on how we construct this notion of rights. And I've made a use of the distinction made by Charles Taylor between the politics of recognition and the politics of difference. The politics of recognition for Charles Taylor is that one that is embraced in the Universal Declarations, and it is based on a long European tradition, and not just European, but a long tradition that I recognize you, you recognize me, and we treat each other equally. We know that recognition at a personal level is crucial to our well-being. The great struggle about who am I, and do you allow me to be me? Do you recognize me? So the politics of recognition is central to a whole lot of social psychology about identity, legitimacy, authenticity. But as a politics for addressing inequality, racism, segregation, I want again to suggest it's got a problem. I have lived through a period of dramatic change. Black power, civil rights, feminism. Feminism changed my life. I, in the 70s, worked in a department that had a strong cadre of radical feminists. I knew I was a man in a way my father never knew. My dad walked through his life as Arthur. From the arrival of feminists, I walked through my life as Charlie, problematic male. Recognition. Feminism changed my ability to know who I was and made my gender much more central to me than it was to my father's. His gender was consensual. It was never a problem. It was the norm. My gender became problematic to be negotiated. The politics of difference comes from a different space. It comes from that whole movement about group rights. If people are victimized because of their group identity, black people, women, gay people, the old, then perhaps we should address their needs and their rights through a collective sense of groupness. And the politics of difference basically says the universalist principles of rights, the same batch of the rights of recognition, need to be delivered with a systematic sensitivity to how the particularity of their expression in relation to each person can be respected. Let me move on here. A simple politics of recognition must be replaced by a radical politics of difference. In other words, to quote the Western Australian substantive equality policy, if you want to treat me equally, you may have to be prepared to treat me differently. I invented that phrase. Why did I invent that? Because in arguing with the cabinet in Western Australia, I was met with a significant block of resistance. Some of it was just racist. Hate you, husband. Some of it was just, what the hell's this guy talking about? Do we need a pommy bastard social scientist to come and bullshit us? And I tried to make sense of what Charles Taylor meant to me, and this is it. If you want to treat me equally, you may have to be prepared to treat me differently. Treating people equally does not mean treating them the same. Feminism was not an attempt by women to be allowed to behave like men. Partly, I understand it, a claim by women to tell men what women wanted, not for men to tell women what they wanted, which had been normative. So for me, what is the rights base that's normative within your sphere of working? What language of rights are you using? And if your concern is about treating people equally and therefore the same, you're in trouble. One of the responses to inequality is to ask questions about who are we seeking to serve. Okay. To move on to racism. If we were to counter racism, How do we understand it? I said I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist. I think I'm a member of the British Social Psychological Society just to be a nuisance in my mind that they should have to put up with me, is my way of thinking. Social psychology has done a huge amount of work to develop our understanding of the nature of racism, but it has also provided a body of argument that has been politically naive. And it comes from that post-war attempt to understand how could the Holocaust happen? How can man be so brutal to each other? And prejudice emerges a powerful explanatory system that extremists were prejudiced, and that we have, from Gordon Allport and his wonderful work in the 1950s onwards, a massive body of relevant literature about how individual psychology facilitates the reproduction of racism as normative and easily carried out. But, this is my argument, the conflation of racism with prejudice and psychologically distressed extremists may have significant implications for a specific raft of policies aimed at promoting the interests of asylum seekers, particularly where the aim is to change the majority society in order to facilitate the integration of asylum seekers. For here the focus will be upon a specific element of the majority society, whilst leaving unaddressed the more subtle forms of racism that may be endemic in the rest of the majority society. Put bluntly, if you look at racism as prejudice, then we have become used, both in the media and in our own thinking and work, to see extreme racism, discrimination, as part of a package of the authoritarian personality, people with warped individual psyche, people with trauma, what one social scientist called the unlovely 10%. Any attitude survey you generate will produce a block at the end of extremist nasties. So if the racist is prejudiced and an extremist, then by definition, the rest of us are moderate. The language of prejudice is very comforting because it assumes we know where the problem lies and it's beyond us. And I want to suggest that that's a very dangerous way of developing policy. It is not that psychology has nothing to say about the nature and the reproduction of prejudice. It is that it is not a sufficient basis for understanding racism. An alternative concept is institutional racism, which really has its roots in sociology and politics rather than psychology. Institutional racism occurs wherever individuals, in carrying out the routine practices of their employment or institution, produce outcomes which, in their effect, discriminate against members of ethnic minority populations. This form of discrimination is much more insidious than that which may be attributable to prejudice, and requires much more extensive initiatives in monitoring, training, and institutional change, if it is to be countered. Put brutally, and it's a phrase I have to say I have some pleasure in saying, and I say it a lot, one of the implications of our understanding of institutional racism is that nice people can discriminate. Us. Intention is not relevant to the viability of institutional racism as a mechanism for reproducing disadvantage, marginalisation, inappropriate treatment of people, asylum seekers, for example. Prejudice is about identity, attitudes, needs. Intent is central to prejudiced people. I hate you, I dislike you, you smell, you stink, you're lazy. Nice people are essential to the effective reproduction of institutional racism because they do what is normative within their institution. And When we look at institutional racism, we are driven to look at where does power rest in organizations? Where does that discretionary power exist to facilitate yes or no, to give or to withhold? Over the years, I've become very aware that I show great respect for secretaries. They're much more powerful in universities than professors. Hierarchy is a myth. There are some people in the hierarchy who have power and can do nasty things to you. I was once introduced by my vice-chancellor as, this is Charles' husband, a leading member of the awkward squad. Power. I was outside the inner circle of the elite. Okay, I paid the price. But the whole thing about institutional racism is that the normative way in which we operate, I spent a decade working with the health professions, talking about developing transcultural practice. And one of the ways in which the health professions discriminated was by treating people equally. That if you get someone who presents themselves to your doctor's surgery, presents themselves to your hospital, and you say, welcome immigrant, I intend to treat you exactly the same as I would treat anybody else, you're discriminating. You have not said, what are your needs and how do I understand them? If, for example, you are from the African Caribbean community in Britain or a Cypriot, your chances of having a hemoglobinopathy, a blood problem, are significantly different to mine. And the likelihood that you've got a specialist in your local hospital who knows that used to be minimal. Massive amount of misdiagnosis. Treating people the same is not treating people equally. So one of the responses to institutional racism at the level of intervention is equality impact assessment. To ask, who are our clients? What are their needs? What are their understandings? For example, if you're treating people in Bradford from the Pakistani community, it might be reasonable to assume in medical practice that they may also simultaneously be using traditional herbal medicines. Perhaps you should ask them, because there can be a powerful interaction between herbal medicine and Western pharmacology. So institutional discrimination is something that we need to address, and it requires us to look at the organizations and the way in which they reproduce power, the way in which they operate on a normative understanding of who is us and who are we working with. And people who don't fit get made problematic. They are the problem. That's the power of professional identity. I could go on about professional. I am very, very troubled by professionalism. When I lecture to journalists, as I do, I've been in Kautokeino, I say, the one thing that worries me is not your absence of professionalism. It is your very professionalism that troubles me. Because you do things so well, so easily, so efficiently. And I want to make you neurotic. I want you to make you think every time you act, not to act with that flair that comes from being a true professional. Professionalism is at the heart of a great deal of institutional racism. Okay. Nasty news for all of us nice people.
So, Charles, I can think about this example of this, but what is your best example of an institution who is doing this?
Universities historically have been very good at institutional racism.
Yeah, I thought about universities.
What are the criteria you use for assessment? In India, for example, if I was to speak Swedish fluently and presented myself for a university interview in England, this would be a big brownie point. If I come from the 100,000 people of Pakistani heritage in Bradford and I speak fluent Urdu, that's just taken for granted. This person is bilingual. They speak fluently a second language.
But it's not personal.
They didn't learn it, did they? They didn't have to acquire it. All sorts of things about how you make people welcome when they arrive, what you do to sustain them, to enable them to get through, to graduate with a first-class honours rather than they scraped it. Does the institution reflect their presence in what's on the walls? So universities are epically good at institutional racism. Yeah. Recent research makes us all nervous. Aversive racism describes the biases of individuals who are politically liberal, who sees themselves as non-racist and who openly endorse non-prejudiced views, but who at the same time have unconscious negative feelings and beliefs that become expressed in subtle and indirect ways, that they are able to rationalize as normal and reasonable. There's a lot of empirical research being done about this in the last decade, and it really is distressing. What it says is that we have moved on in many societies from the comfortable acceptance of the inferiority of others, the comfortable acceptance of our own superiority in national, ethnic, gender terms. And we live in a world where the politics of recognition has been impacted by the politics of diversity. We are aware that the capacity to express our prejudices has been changed, and we've changed ourselves. We are much more small l liberal. But we are also the products of our background, of our socialization, of our identity. I'm not English, I'm a northerner. I come from the north of England. It's my identity. Ironically, I'm not sure I could comfortably live there. I haven't lived in the northeast for 5 decades. I'm not sure I belong any longer, but I'm a northerner. It's me. And it's those sorts of undertows that are laid down in our socialization. And some of it has to do with the racist sentiments that are part of our culture, which we are capable of cognitively removing from our vernacular, removing from our daily visual and interpersonal expression as we interact. We don't say vulgar things anymore. Nobody uses the N-word. But have we really stopped being racist? At some level we have suppressed. And the researchers know that a great deal of aversive racism still exists, and particularly in those who espouse liberal credentials. And the reason I put this into my notes for you is the problem with this is that we, the liberals, believe that this is true, that we are liberal. In America, where most of this research is done, the evidence is that black people know differently. They are able to scan the subliminal, the subtle, non-verbal behavior. So that it means in interpersonal interaction, liberals may come away feeling that was nice, that went very well. But the person you've been talking to is thinking, yes, seen that before. Nice liberal veneer over an old-fashioned racist. And when we go back to Frida yesterday talking about trust, connectedness between the therapist and the client, then a good caring professional has no inoculation against aversive racism. And we need to be in touch with questions about how do we get in touch with aversive racism. I think it's very difficult. But it also has questions about who do we trust to front our organization when we are developing policies. Who are the we who are seeking to develop the initiative? Frequently, we are comfortable with our good intentions and can develop policies. But should we trust ourselves to do so is what I'm saying on the basis of my arguments today and on the literature. I'm afraid there's 25 pages of it. I don't expect you to read it all. You can dip into it as you feel inclined. But since I was speaking English, I felt a need to back it up. And part of what I'm writing in this latter part of those 25 pages is around this issue of who are the we. with asylum seekers, frequently they come to a country and they're not embedded in our population. So it's difficult to recruit people from that community. There's no excuse for not having Somali and Moroccan people recruited into the infrastructure of Helsinki. None. Just as working up in Kautokeino, you become very aware of the positioning of the Sami in Finland and in Sapmi in general and in Nordic states. Who do we recruit? And if we recruit someone from the asylum community to work with us, are we aware of the literature on intersectionality, on hybridity? And the question is, who are we aiming to benefit? If you're working with, as Frida was talking about yesterday, young people, then appointing somebody who shares their ethnicity, but who is 30 or 40 years older, may not be an improvement on having a well-intentioned member of the majority population. Gender, age, generation can be as much of a problem in understanding the needs of people as ethnicity. So there's a big questions here about how we proceed to develop our work. And I'll finish just by echoing a couple of the concerns in the latter pages of the notes I prepared for you. We live in a world where the efforts of people like us are now routinely compromised, indeed contaminated, by the politics of anti-radicalization, by counter-terrorism. Social Cohesion and Counter-Terrorism is a book that I produced with Eunice, where we looked in Britain at the parallel movement of policies of social cohesion, how to promote non-discriminatory social cohesion, and at the same time policies of counter-terrorism, the anti-radicalization initiatives of Prevent, etc. And the data carried out in a number of metropolitan authorities unambiguously showed how counter-terrorism and its ramifications into areas of social work, social practice, had fundamentally changed the environment in which social workers operated. We cannot easily separate one policy agenda from another. And who we work with is an interesting question, because one of the ways in which this issue of counter-terrorism operates was that most local authorities are small c conservative. They are risk averse. Why? Because your career's on the line. So who do you collaborate with? If there's an immigrant organisation that has a veneer of edginess about them, they keep rattling cages, they keep making a nuisance of themselves, who do you choose to collaborate with? Our research showed that in the north of England, metropolitan authorities really like working with people they've worked with before. A safe pair of hands was the phrase. Nice say, oh, we've worked with them before, they're okay. The way in which members of minority communities get smeared with the contaminated language of radicalization impacts on how they become perceived as potential allies in our struggle. When I first went to Bradford in the early 70s, there was a group, the Asian Youth Movement, who I was told were naughty and dangerous. So, of course, I went and sought them out. It was a relatively small group of Asian men who were radical, but nobody's idea of dangerous. What happened? One became a member of Parliament for Bradford, one became a chief executive of a major metropolitan authority. These were the radicals of the 70s, the dangerous people. They were an important part of the politics of change, generational change. Their radicalization was addressed more to the internal politics of their community, no longer accepting the abuse their parents had accepted. So that one of the questions that I really do push in the latter part of my notes to you is, who do you regard as natural allies in addressing the challenge? And there's a real problem about risk-taking in developing links with people who we need to be working with. So I shall stop there. I'm sorry if I haven't handed out little nuggets of pre-packaged policy. That's something you already possess. You know where to go and look for stuff. You already have your own initiatives. I've had the arrogance, I'm afraid, to say, if I'm to talk about 40 years' worth of work in this area, it is that the things that I've addressed are as important as the concrete initiatives. It's what frames where you start from that's essential. It's what allows you to anticipate where the points of leverage are in identifying your allies, in recognizing the resistances you will experience and why that resistance is there, and recognizing the strange company you keep. I mean, going to ECHA meetings was really strange. All the people there had signed up to the 10-point plan of action. There was almost no cohesion about what that actually meant. So you have to be very careful to keep asking yourself, who are we working with? What's the cost of collaboration? Are we true to ourselves? And do we know who we are serving? And have we talked to them enough? Are we developing policies for asylum seekers? Or are we developing policies with asylum seekers? Enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.